Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first SALT Lunchbox. Hopefully you can hear me out there. I'm Dave Burt, SALT founder and your host for today. Before we start, let's take a moment to ensure that everyone is ready and familiar with the webinar control panel. First, if you have a question or a comment, click on the Q&A logo at the base of your screen, unless you're on an iPad, in which case it's at the top of your screen. So why not give it a go now and let us know who you are and where you are. Hopefully we've got some people out there listening. In fact, we've had a terrific response. We know we do. One of our team members, Larice, will be sending through these questions and comments at the appropriate time. So let's go. I'm excited. My name is Dave, and SALT is a not-for-profit health education company that normally presents in clubs and workplaces on wellbeing and mental health, respect and equality, positive coaching, positive sports parenting, and a whole lot more. Today, I will tell you a little bit about SALT and what we do, because some of you won't know about us, but these webinars are not about SALT. They're about you. So while I'm speaking today, I want you to start writing in questions and comments that we'll share in the most important part of today, which is the question and answer section. We don't just want questions, we want comments. You might just have something encouraging to say, something great that you've done that might help others. So just quickly, let me tell you about SALT, and I want to tell you a story about a club and a father that faced into a trauma. SALT began in 2015, and we have since then delivered around 1,800 interactive presentations into hundreds of sporting clubs, as well as schools and businesses. We did have over 1,000 sessions budgeted for in 2020, but for the time being, we'll place these on hold and we will be working from home like many of you. And we're excited by the opportunity because we have a unique crisis occurring that requires a unique response. Over the time of this coronavirus challenge, our aim is to bring some positivity into each day. These sessions will not be a talk fest. They'll focus on practical ways that you can help yourself and those who you love and care for. Our two major purposes are to inspire and connect. So we will have about 5 to 10 minutes of content, followed by 20 to 25 minutes or so of questions, answers, and discussion. We'll have a range of different experts and guests joining our team for different topics. We're also going to interview people about their own lived experiences when we think that the stories might inspire you. We need to remind you that primarily we are educators rather than counsellors or psychologists. We do, however, draw our content and feedback from relevant expert sources. We have a team of around 12 people working in the background to make these webinars possible, and terrific partners for the program in Bendigo Bank, Eastland Shopping Centre, and FC Business Solutions. Back in 2015, we began SALT because we saw a unique opportunity arise. For many years, I'd spoken to people about the power of sporting clubs. Within them, we saw people at their very best. They were courageous, sacrificial, disciplined. They made good decisions under pressure. They communicated clearly. They were selfless in the name of footy or basketball or whatever they were playing. But off the field, many clubs, especially from my experience, footy and cricket clubs, were still bastions of poor behaviour. Binge drinking was still celebrated and encouraged. Women were spoken of in sexual terms and often felt uncomfortable at club events. If people had a problem, it was considered a weakness to talk about it, so they didn't speak up. To cut a long story short, I quit my job and became the Victorian Coordinator for Sports Chaplaincy Australia. And during that time, I was called to 7 clubs who'd experienced the loss of one of their communities through suicide. I was asked to help them get back on their feet. And while I wasn't an expert in this particular field, I had a warm heart and a clear head and was able to help. One of the clubs I went to was the Bond Beach Football Club, who just lost a 17-year-old boy named Justin. And I got asked to go to the club 2 days after the event, and I walk out onto the ground and the first seconds and under-19s are about to start training, and I spoke to them for about 5 or 10 minutes about grief and loss. And then I said, if anybody wants to come into the club rooms and talk, it's good for men to talk if you feel like you're not coping and coach has given you permission. And so as I walked off the ground, I didn't know whether anybody would come, but as it turned out, the whole under-19 team followed. And as we were walking off the ground, I noticed around the edge of the ground were friends and family who'd come to the football club, I guess, not knowing where else to come to do their grieving. And we walked up into the club rooms, and the coach set the boys out in a kind of a horseshoe shape, and he sat to my right and he introduced me and he said this. He said, boys, you know that I love you. I've coached many of you to 2 premierships, but I don't know what to do here. So we've got an expert with us today who's going to talk to you. And again, I didn't feel like an expert at all. But I said to the first boy on my left, I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 means you're coping really well and 1 means you're really struggling, what number are you? And the first few boys all answered in similar ways. They all said, oh, we're okay, we're a 5, we're a 6, we're sad because everybody else is, but we're doing okay. We got about 3 or 4 boys in, and a boy called Pete says, well, actually, I'm not coping. He said, I was driving to work today. I got about halfway. I burst into tears. I turned around. I went back home again. And it turned out Pete was the next door neighbour of Justin. He'd grown up with him, so he knew him really well. I said to the boys, put your hand up now if you're a mate of Pete's. Just put your hand up high. And every boy immediately put their hands up. I said, now keep your hand up, but only if you're willing to go the journey with Pete. And by that, I mean you're going to check in on him. Not just tonight, but tomorrow night, next week, in a month and 6 months' time, as is appropriate, I want you to check in. Now, if you're willing to do that, keep your hand up. And every boy had their hand up, and I knew they meant it because they were eyeballing Pete. I said, Pete, have a look. And Pete, who had his head down, lifts his head up, and through his teary eyes, he acknowledges that every single boy in the room was there for him. And that changed the whole tone and tenor of the room. After that, because of Pete, other boys started to open up as well, and they showed vulnerability, and they started to share if they weren't coping. And we started to match people who had capacity with people who had needs. And as we were going through the boys, I noticed a man at the back of the room start to move towards the front of the room. And I hadn't noticed him previously. But he moves all the way up and he comes and stands right next to me. And I look at him, he's fairly disheveled. He's about my age. And he says, I need to speak to the boys. And so not knowing what else to do, I said, okay, speak. And he introduced himself, and his name was Graham, and he was the father of Justin. I hadn't even known he was there. And he said, boys, my son was strong in so many ways, but my son was weak because he didn't talk to someone when he had a problem. And if you've got a problem, you're going to have to talk to someone. So I'm going to open my home on a Thursday night. And if you come past, I'll put on pizzas and you'll help me because you'll take the place of my son. And maybe I can help you by being another father role model in your life. Back in 2018, I went back to the Bond Beach Football Club. I invited Graham to come with me and I interviewed him. And 4 years later, he still had his home open. Those boys were still coming into that non-judgmental space to have those conversations. It's been part of his healing journey. But getting back to the night, we finished hearing from all of the boys, and the night went a long time. Many people opened up and shared about how they were going, a whole range of issues that they were facing. But afterwards, I was speaking to Graham, the father, and he said yesterday, the day after the incident occurred, 200 or 300 kids were rioting at the scene of the tragedy. They were throwing rocks, they were yelling, they were crying, they were graffitiing. They were out of control. The police were trying to move them on. The teachers were trying to get them back into school and they wouldn't cooperate. And so the police rang me and they said, can you come and get the kids off the tracks? And so I went up there and I said, get off the tracks because this is not what Justin would have wanted. And so they did. And then I realised there and then it was a watershed moment for me where I recognised the potential in this particular sporting club, but the potential of any connected group to go to a whole new level. And possibly in this case, it took a crisis to bring this about, but did it need to? Could we not do something proactively to get these sorts of conversations happening without there having to be a tragedy? And so we started SALT as a not-for-profit health education company. And we've seen clubs going from being resistant at the beginning to enthusiastic about their roles as value-driven, connected communities of excellence. And I feel like we now have an opportunity that it's arisen through the coronavirus. We're being challenged to see life differently. We've never experienced anything like this on such a shared global scale. And I think we need to become a little bit more like a global club. So I want to take 3 points from the Bond Beach story, and we'll give you 3 takeaway points from every one of our SALT Lunchbox sessions. Firstly, the coach opened by saying, boys, you know that I love you. Now, maybe they knew this or maybe they didn't, but he had to say it. Perhaps it shouldn't have required a tragedy to elicit those words, but sometimes it takes a tragedy to bring the best out in us. Secondly, it took someone to be vulnerable for us to see the connections to start happening. And Pete had to say to the rest of the group, I'm not coping. And after he did that, he gave permission for others to follow. It takes courage to show vulnerability and let people help you. We need people who are not coping to let others know. People won't lose respect for you. They will respect you more because we know how hard this is to do. Thirdly, Graham the father was suffering from deep grief, and immediately he chose to deal with that grief by offering to help others through their pain. Some of you will have followed the story of Neil Danaher, an AFL legend who's dying of motor neurone disease. He's started the M&D Foundation and has run a huge event to fundraise for a cure called the Big Freeze. He was asked by a player, why don't you just tick off your bucket list? Why don't you just do what you want to do? You haven't got long left. He replied, because this gives me no satisfaction whatsoever. What helps me is helping others, because when you help others, resilience is a natural byproduct. So 3 points. Tell people you love them, be prepared to be vulnerable, and heal yourself by serving and helping others. Okay, we're going to go to questions and comments. We'd love to hear from you, either your questions or what you've done that's been effective and helpful. And joining me to answer these today is Edwina Rickey and Lane Stretton. Lane works in suicide prevention and mental health. His studies have been in behavioural psychology and counselling. He is the chair of SALT and a director of Roses in the Ocean and Yellow Box Careers. Edwina, as well as being a psychology and maths teacher, is the project manager for the implementation of wellbeing literacy into 27 schools in the Maroondah Schools Network in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. So I'm going to have a look at our questions, and I can see a whole range of people that I've known and met in the past, and it's absolutely fantastic. We've got Sarah from Barry Plant and Bob Simpson and Kim Gray and a whole range of people, and we've got some questions, and I'm going to go to the first one that says this. My husband does not have a close relationship with his father and is not good at showing any weakness in front of our kids. How can I get him to let down his guard and model this vulnerability to our kids? And Lane, I'm going to throw to you to have a go at answering that. How can we be more vulnerable when it's not part of our typical mindset?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. What a great question. And can I firstly say how much I love your stories, mate? I could sit and listen to your stories forever. You tell an amazing story about an amazing group of people. It's really complex, isn't it? You know, how much vulnerability do we show? It takes a lot of courage to show vulnerability, particularly to our kids. And I don't know if there's an appropriate level or inappropriate level. It just depends on circumstance. And if I could say this, I think maybe the most important thing is the self-care of the individual that I'm talking to. So if what I'm about to do is actually likely to increase the distress of the children or the kids, then why would I go down that particular path and cause them that sort of distress? So it might be in that moment that I need to keep some of that stuff to myself, or find an appropriate level of communication that's helpful for them, not unhelpful for them. When we're facing, you know, really complex and difficult situations, self-care becomes of paramount importance. And it's important for me to ensure that I'm okay, but then it's important that whatever it is that I do is not going to have a detrimental impact on the people that I'm communicating to. So, you know, I think there's a level of courage required, but also there's an appropriateness about what I share and what I don't share, depending on the nature of the audience.
Great, thanks, Lane. I'm going to try and keep our answers fairly brief, Ed, because we've got lots of questions coming in, which is just terrific. Ed, did you want to say anything to that last question before we move on?
No, look, I think Lane covered it all. I think courage is so important. I think it's just important that we're authentic. And so we talk about our experiences, we share with one another and inspire one another. Yeah,
kids need us to be really honest at this time. And I think too, when we're trying to skill up each other, if we recognise that this is in the best interest of our kids, that we're modelling something which our kids can then model themselves. We have inherited certain habits from our parents that, unless we question them and perhaps, you know, reinvent ourselves a little, we're just going to pass them on to our kids. So terrific. I've got a question here from Tim Hable. Coaches are leaders in clubs, but many clubs have had to lay coaches off due to financial issues. Thoughts around that? I'll make a start on that. We very, very much see that coaches have of late changed their roles from being people who are expert in whatever their particular sport is to people who are appointed because they have some degree of experience or expertise in managing people. And I think that if you've been laid off as a coach right now of a club for financial reasons, my encouragement would be to you that your role hasn't finished, that your role now is to remain in contact with your playing group who will still be looking to you, whether you're paid or not paid, to reach out and check out how they're going, because clubs are not actually about football or cricket or basketball. Clubs are about people. And right now, the fact that you've been stood down, which is difficult for you, is going to really show your leadership capacity as to whether or not you continue to lead in this space, and that your leadership now becomes, how are our people going? Do they have networks around them? Are they connected? And how can our club during this time position itself to be a better club in the future through the time we had to rethink and reinvent ourselves? Terrific. I've got a question from James Gallagher. Keen to hear about the power of talking to young people about suicide. Can it have a negative impact? Why is the term committed suicide no longer used? Lane, I'll throw to you because you're an expert in this space.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert, Dave, but I certainly have a lived experience of suicide. I lost my brother Nathan to suicide, and as a result of that, I've spent a lot of time studying this. We need to demystify the whole subject of suicide. We need to normalise conversation. We need to make it okay for people to talk about it, and we need to be open with how we feel about that particular subject. But we need to do so in a way that's safe. And one of the simple things that we can do is make sure that we're not talking about method. And the other thing is, little things like this expression committed. Where did the expression committed suicide come from? Well, originally the expression committed suicide came about because suicide was considered a crime, and also it was considered a sin. Now, it's neither a crime nor a sin, and I don't want to think of my brother as being a criminal or a sinner. And so from that perspective, using the word committed, which has such strong connotation historically, is an inappropriate way now of talking about suicide. So we've got to find other ways, like, of expressing that.
Great. Thank you, Ed. I've got a question from Stuart Gilmore. I'm going to throw this one to you, Edwina. Through adversity and restriction on personal one-to-one communication, how do we best stay connected to ensure how our mates, our friends are all coping?
Well, I think it's the little things, Dave, that matter. I've got a mum who's in social isolation. She's 92, in aged care and completely locked down. So, we've put an iPad in there. It may take us the whole time to get that iPad working, but, we've got to think of new ways. A friend whose mum is in aged care had a birthday party where they opened the doors and they sat back, but they were still able to have those things. I think we don't want to be limited by the challenges. We need to be creative around how we connect. That now more than ever, obviously people do want to be connected. We can't do it in the traditional ways. There's no hugs, there's no of those things that we perhaps really need, but we've got to think of creative ways of connecting. So I would just say, be really intentional around connection and how you can do that, and do it as often as you can or often as you feel you need.
I think it's really interesting. I've been speaking to a lot of aged people who are finding this really difficult because they're isolated, but also they're not skilled up on technology. And I reckon one of the wonderful opportunities that we've got is if we've got kids at home who are good at technology and we're wanting to get them to help and serve others, one way that they could do that would be to teach their grandparents or any other elderly people how to have these communications through online platforms. I was teaching my mum the other day how to have a Zoom conversation, and we found that it was terrific. We could see each other, but I could also type things that she couldn't quite understand if she couldn't quite hear me properly. So I think there's terrific ways that we can, as you say, explore. And gee, wouldn't it be great even just to write letters occasionally like we used to do in the past out to people? Terrific. I've got another question. On the topic of getting kids to help, I don't know that it's typically part of our DNA to naturally, want to have that kind of heart to help others. But what are some really good things that we can get our kids to do during this time to help others. Ed, you got some answers to that?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really unique time, and I would really encourage getting our kids to journal, to be able to write daily how they're feeling. And obviously this is evolving over every day, and there's constant changes happening to their environment, but getting them to appreciate the things that they do have. Actually, perhaps the 3 things that went well for us today, doing that morning and night and sitting around and sharing that as a family. But I think perhaps even as parents, if we do that too, we journal and we can share our emotions, and that comes back to that vulnerability. But I think, you know, for me, this is a significant time in history, and what a way to be thinking for the future, being able to look back on this vulnerability over time.
Thanks. We've had a couple of people write in, Ines and some others, to ask how SALT is going at the moment and how we're all faring personally. Well, obviously, we were planning to do the sessions into clubs and businesses, and we had a lot booked. So far, a lot of our supporters have remained supportive, and we're very, very grateful for that, and have enabled us to be able to do things like set up this podcast. I think all of us are affected. I only found out this morning that my daughter Caitlin has the coronavirus. She's actually living in London, and you know, it's hard. And when your kids are living overseas, she's been there 4 years. You don't have that connection with them, and so we've become quite used to having her at the dinner table on an iPad. We sit her in her seat, and we have our meal, and she just joins into the conversation like everybody else. The other thing has been that, you know, she remains very, very positive. She said, I'm going to become part of the new superhuman race, and we're going to go out and fight this thing because we'll all be immune. So we're actually going really, really well. We've had some new people come on board to say, can we do some stuff in their organisations with our wellbeing and mental health sessions, but do it in this way. And I think now that we're learning to do things through media, we'll probably come out of this at the end, as long as financially we come out of it at the end, which we're planning to do, in a stronger place overall. Terrific. Let me go to another question. We've got a few minutes left. I've always found it really hard to say I love you, writes one of our people. Must it be said in words, or can we just show it through actions? What about you, Lane? I'll throw to you there. Saying I love you. That coach said, boys, you know that I love you. I never used to hear men say that in the past, but I think we're getting better at it. But I'll throw to you.
Yeah, well, mate, I couldn't honestly say to you that this is probably my specialty area, and I'm certainly no expert in the whole love stakes. And you know, one thing that my wife did make me read when I was first married, bless her, was I think it was called The 5 Languages of Love. And for those who are familiar with it, you know, it was probably the go-to book to read for young couples when they first got married. And what I found out from that was that her love language was physical touch. So she needed to be hugged and she needed to feel that affection, but mine was acts of service. And I don't need that physical touch, but if you do something for me, then I'm going to be enormously grateful for that, and I'm going to see that as you showing love to me. So I think love can be defined in lots of different ways, and I don't think we should get hung up on a particular way that it's expressed. We need to allow for everybody to express that love that we have for each other in lots of different ways.
Terrific. I'm just seeing a lot of questions come through. We've only got 6 minutes left. We are going to stick strictly to time. I reckon, Edwina, you could have spoken about love. Oh, you're nodding your head. I'll throw to you, Edwina. Just add something to what Lane had to say.
Look, I'm just so great. I'm so grateful, Lane, you brought up the languages of love. There is a book that he wrote, the teenagers and their languages of love. So people could, you know, if you really want to know, my husband is also acts of service and I'm affirmation. And so it is quite funny. And I think we could explore this even more as we go into our you know, our sessions over the weeks, because the languages of love, it's been there for a long time, but it's so relevant today.
Yeah, my love language is food. So if anybody's just wondering. Our great friend Stuart Gregg from the Bendigo Bank, tips for our Bendigo Bank staff to use if they're showing signs of being anxious during these tough times. In workplaces, Lane, what can we do to reduce anxiety and to bring that extra sense of connection and care into the workplace? I'll throw to you.
Yeah, well, the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge it, and almost accept that it's a given in the work environment right now. You know, we have this way of kind of responding to people asking us how we are by saying, "Hey, I'm fine," and we usually use that expression because when we put it into perspective with other people, we generally are pretty fine. But fine's one of those really, you know, loose ways of describing how we're feeling. And what I would encourage people to do is to actually find the words, the proper words to express how I'm feeling, because in so doing, the gift that we give to them is the gift of intimacy and the gift of opening ourselves up to a conversation, and the gift that we offer to them is the opportunity for them to help. And so the more we can express how we're feeling, the more we can talk about it in really open and honest ways, the more likely we are that when we really need it, we're going to get the help that we need.
Terrific. I would like to just touch on this one from Simon Rodder. We're down to 4 minutes, but are there any recommended strategies to ensure online engagement doesn't increase feelings of cyberbullying? I think, Lane, again, I'll just throw to you in a minute or so. How do we make sure that when our kids are online, and I read somewhere this morning that, you know, social media is actually becoming social media rather than, you know, how we've seen it before as a distraction of, you know, people living better lives than us. But how can we make sure that if our kids are engaging at this time on social media, that they're staying in that safe zone? And look, we've got one of our team, Neil Milton from Child Safe, and we will be talking to him later in the series about social media and keeping our kids safe. But just briefly, Lane, in a couple of sentences. Yeah,
I'm not an expert in social media, nor am I an expert in cyberbullying. But what I would say is this, that I think there's a couple of things. One is to actually help our children to understand what healthy engagement actually looks like, and how to engage in a way that's aligned with their own personal values. That is, what behavior is acceptable, what behavior is unacceptable. And the second thing is for them to understand how what's an appropriate way to cope with cyberbullying if you see cyberbullying occurring, not only to others, but also to yourself, and having the courage to be able to call out the behavior for what it is, and to do the right thing in that particular situation.
Great. Ed, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think in schools we call it bucket filling. And I think it's about, does this fill someone's bucket, or is this taking out of someone's bucket? And I think if we think about high quality connections, and going back to Stuart's point around Bendigo Bank or our kids online, it's about being mindful of the communication. And does this light someone up? Does this deplete someone? And really thinking about that before we put messages out there.
Fantastic. Really want to thank everybody. 3 takeaway points from today. Number 1, tell people that you love them. You may think that they know, and they might know, but they need to hear it again, and probably more often during this difficult time. Number 2, be vulnerable, not just for your sake, but for the sake of others. When you're courageous enough to be vulnerable, you open up permission for others to follow. And number 3, help yourself by helping others. Resilience is a direct byproduct of giving your love and energy to others. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. Spread the word among your friends. Tell us how we can improve. We're still working on integrating more online platforms to increase how we can connect effectively. So if you want to access further resources, we're going to start putting the resources that we're using onto the Sport and Life Training Facebook site. Also, if we couldn't answer your questions today, we'll continue to answer your questions on our Facebook site. You can upload them if you have some questions afterwards. We're also setting up an assistance platform on our Facebook site where people can list their needs and others can offer help of various kinds. And if anybody's feeling like they need to talk to someone, the Lifeline number is listed here, 24/7 help available. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about a thing called emotional agility. And that again, will talk a little bit about the language that we use. So thank you for joining us. And remember, folks, we will come out of this time better, stronger, and richer in the things that really matter. Thanks, everybody.